Okay, now we have a little bit more than 10 minutes for discussion. And I will open up, as I usually do, right to the audience. But there was something that I think you both, I saw your mimics agreed. You probably agreed on a lot of things. But this line that Professor Hassan said, City was selling its assets to the highest bidder. And I saw Robert nodding his head strongly. And also maybe connect to this, because both of you, or Robert mentioned Richard Sennett yesterday, and one of the things he talked about in his open source system, or open system, was that there is maybe a need to design informality in a certain level. And we have seen what happens when one starts to design informality, as you showed on your pictures. It can go both ways. So a little bit of reflection that City selling its assets to the highest bidder and designing informality. Your thoughts on both. And I think the microphones are working. Okay. Or how to solve that, or what is our answer to that?
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think it's a field that needs to be explored. I mean, for 40 years, we worked in the Urangi pilot project with a communities that are about nearly 2 million now. It's possible to design informality if you respect informality and if you respect people. Otherwise, if you have fixed rules and regulations, 20% open here, 40% open there, you don't respect dissolved space, which planners normally don't. So you don't end up. The most important thing in designing informality is to see what people can afford, what can they put into construction and building, and how they can improve incrementally. This incremental development is extremely important to understand, because that's the only way the poor will ever achieve housing. So these are two issues, I think, that are important in designing informality. And then one very big factor is love and affection. If you don't have that, I don't think you even understand informality.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, you know, I'm not an architect or a planner or anyone who builds things, but I do think I would second that if there is the possibility of designing for informality, we have to accept time as the mortgage. So instead of looking at getting all the money at once and building everything all at once, you look at time as your mortgage, and you're building over time with what assets people have. And also, and I think it's echoing exactly what you said, you have to respect the way in which people use things already. So the informality is there. It's a misleading term, because it's not a thing, it's just how people live. It's a relationship. And the more that we come to understand that, I think the easier it will be to come up with strategies for how to create rule-bound informality, if that's not a contradiction in terms.
Great, thank you. Okay, as I usually do, I open up right away. And really good questions, as you know. Okay, let's see, we got one hand here.
Okay. Well, thank you both really for turning this narrative on its head in a way. And I don't want to steer the conversation away from the Global South, but just wanted to say that I hope we do see both of these presentations as a provocation for the developed world too. You got me thinking, Robert, about another journalist, Ted Simon, this British journalist that circumnavigated the globe on a motorbike twice. He did it in 1973 on an old Triumph and wrote a book about it, and he did it 30 years later on a BMW. And the first book is fascinating because the Triumph breaks down all the time. And he meets people and he gets invited into their homes and has these incredible human interactions. And the second book is really dull because the BMW never breaks down. And by almost every design standard, the BMW is superior. But I think by the criteria of a lot of the people in this room, actually, the Triumph is achieving better social outcomes. and I don't know, just got excited thinking about that as a kind of metaphor for public space in a way. And I maybe would say not just designing for informality, but actually in a way designing for inconvenience or inefficiency insofar as that means requiring human interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I'll have to read those books, which I haven't read. But you know, I was thinking about it. We know this in other areas of design. So I remember writing an article about in the early days of the computerization of music, and there was a guy at the MIT Media Lab, Todd Machower, who was creating augmented instruments with digital technology. But what he kept insisting was super important in creating augmented instruments was building in physical limitation. That, you know, the solution was not some kind of screen and you could just make gestures and music would happen, because that didn't contain the element of technique and mastery and breathing and all the kinds of things that we've come to expect with actually playing an instrument. And so his puzzle was how to retain physical limitation with a technology that seems to dispense with physical limitation. And so we know that that's a super important point in design in all sorts of other areas, but then we figure there has to be this like absolute perfection of form, which is, you know, maybe a noble utopia, but it doesn't exist. And we also know that, I mean, every planner knows in urban parks, for instance, this concept of desire lines. You build a lawn and people walk across it, and then the grass dies. Because that's the way that people want to go, even though the pathway that you've designed goes this way, people want to use it that way. And that needs to be okay and accepted, and the answer to that is not fencing in the desire line to prevent people from doing it. The answer is to find a way to create a structure that allows for that. Seems sensible to me, but you know, how to get people to accept the old Triumph instead of the BMW, I don't know.
Thank you. I remember the one thing, we had our speakers in the first conference, Alfredo Brillenburg and Hubert Klumpner, that worked with informality in South America especially. And they mentioned on one occasion that there's a lack of tools to observe, read, and represent the current social spatial reality of the contemporary informal mega cities. We still don't understand, and we don't even have the vocabulary to understand what's going on. And especially in the professional world, that creates enormous problems. Just a small reflection, maybe from both of you before we give one more.
Actually, I think you have to build on what is happening. In my experience, there are three things that you have to support people with. One is cheaper technology, and that can be developed within the settlement itself. The other is issues related to health. Light, ventilation, and thirdly, how to deal with areas where there is water in the house so that they are not porous. I think these are the only issues that you really need to support communities with. And the organic form that emerges out of this, in my opinion, can be quite attractive. And even planners who might object to the standards, I think would appreciate it immensely. This is the new vernacular, in my opinion, and it should be looked at as the new vernacular.
Yeah, I would just say, and seconding this, that cities are not purely built form. You know, in fact, cities are not fundamentally built form. They're fundamentally people, and the cultures and the things that people do in the cities. And the cities are just baskets that allow for people to do the things that they do. And so if we approach, for instance, the informal settlements everywhere in the city as just, these are places that people live and work and have lives, and understand that if there's any intervention in those, what it must be is working with the ways that people live and who they are, then that's a much more effective way of building for the city than just considering a brick and mortar solution. You know, I remember I used to be a community organizer before I was a writer. I was an activist and a rabble-rouser, and I was fighting against the redevelopment of Times Square, okay? And we lost, but they did an environmental impact statement, and in the environmental impact statement, every park in the surrounding area was listed as underutilized land. And everything was expected to be developed to the quote-unquote highest and best use. Well, the highest and best use in Midtown Manhattan is always an office building or a luxury condo. There's no other alternative. So we have to scrap those kind of traditional mindset definitions of what development looks like. And what development really looks like is development of the creative potential of the people.
Great. Please, we have 2 questions, 3, and then we have to cut it. Yes.
I'm very interested in the oath you showed for planners and designers. And as someone who serves on the Commission for the American Institute of Certified Planners, we have an ethical requirement. And I was thinking yesterday in our professional session, I was talking about how can we use the ethical standards for our professional organizations to facilitate moving this forward, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
You know, I suggested this oath, took this pledge also, after I saw a doctor respond to the Hippocratic Oath. We were in a hospital and the patient was not being attended to. And I said to the doctor, I said, you took an oath. Have you forgotten that? And he said, thank you for reminding me. I'll go to hell if I do not attend to this patient. So that was how this issue came up. And at the same time, we had a very bad project in some ways in Karachi, which I was criticizing. So I put the 2 things together. Now, this oath has been taken up at various levels with architects. It's been modified, it's been changed, but it has not been accepted. And as the head of the Institute of Architects said to me, he said, Arif bhai, Arif brother, we are sitting in the bazaar, and you expect us to take this oath. It's simply not possible. I'll never get elected again. So that is how it is. But I think that the pressure that is now building up and the changes that are taking place in architectural institutions in spite of neoliberal thinking, I think will lead to some sort of an oath. And I think it will happen in my lifetime if I live 5 more years.
Can I add one thought to that, which I think the oath is wonderful and it's a great thing. But I also think there's a kind of policy oath that maybe needs to be taken, which is, at this point, absolutely no demolitions on the scale of what went on in Sodom and Gomorrah in Accra or in Oshodi in Lagos. That, I think, would move the debate forward because people would then know that they're not under immediate threat. And anyone who's under immediate threat is in desperate situation.
Can I add to that? Well, when you have big events like FIFA, what is the one, Formula 1 in Istanbul, Peking Olympics, Delhi Commonwealth Games, you have huge demolitions and disaster. I think it could go in millions if I added it all up together. So I think this is one thing that should be taken into consideration. An event city, which is a 1990s concept, an event city should not be responsible for this massive destruction of homes and lives.
Thank you. Peter, and then we have one more.
This is not really fully considered, but I'm responding in an organic, dynamic way in the sense that I think we all should to these new insights and new pieces of information. It strikes me that there's a language and definitional challenge for all of us when we use words in the context of planning, efficiency, scale, that we don't really know what these words should mean, and we should be thinking more about open definitions of our own terminology. That's what worries me most about these documents that we're all being asked to finalize. I think they're all assumptions implicit in a lot of the descriptions, and we haven't finished thinking, and yet we're trying to finalise, and I think that's very dangerous. If we thought that on the 1st of July 2015 we'd suddenly mastered the subject and we'd completed our thought processes, we're bound to be wrong, and yet that seems to be the way we're operating.
Okay, this is an interesting one. You want to take a crack on it?
Well, you know, events have objectives, and so you move towards the objective that is set. I think the vocabulary is extremely important. That is what I have learned in the process of my work. New vocabularies that have developed over the last 20 years and concepts. It's not the business of the state to do business, for example. Lots of things like this have really changed the whole structure of thinking of professionals. And I think that there is a need to challenge this structure of thinking and this vocabulary, and to put it in context as to where it has come from. Most of this vocabulary has been developed to serve larger corporate interests, in my opinion. And if you are interested, there is a whole essay of mine on vocabulary and what it has done to academic institutions, at least in my country. I can't talk about other countries. So this is a very important point that has been raised, the question of vocabulary and what it means.
Thank you. One last question. Sorry, Harrison.
Hello to everybody. I was very interested about the topic about informal, because in South America, in general Latin America, we have a lot of these issues in our cities, because the models of the cities changed in the 90s, of this trying to make cities more attractive, more globally. And I was wondering, what do you think about transforming now the formal to informal, returning to the roots of the things that urban planning of the local government in those times created? So returning to the basis of what people really need and miss. Thank you.
Yeah, go.
In my opinion, the formal has already become informal because it is corrupt. It functions on large-scale land expropriation, illegal construction, illegal sources of funding. So it has become informal. It's not formal anymore, in my opinion. But this has also divided the city. And I think we must understand this issue in greater detail. Because if you look at the older so-called informal settlements, they were nearer to their places of work. And so, in quote-unquote, they were sustainable. Today, these spaces have been taken over by the new informality. That is the informality of the rich. And the new settlements that are emerging are very far from places of work. So the form of the city is changing because it is becoming cheaper to rent closer to places of work than own a place way out into the city. This division is, in my opinion, the most serious division that has taken place, because there is a very strong anti-poor bias in planning and policy. And this anti-poor bias in planning and policy divides the city further by very different levels of investment in these two areas. I mean, if you look at the nature of investments per capita, in the upgrading process for informal settlements and investments that are made in the formal areas, the difference would be over 2,000%, in my opinion, what we have worked out. So I think this debate is essential. And it's an ethical debate, essentially. It's a question of ethics. It's not a question of law. The judges in my country are the worst thing that you can describe. They pass some very good pro-people judgment. But on the question of land, their thinking is determined by the law that exists, not by any ethical issues. So you can, it's like having apartheid in South Africa, which was legal, because there was a law. So you can frame any law and do any grave injustice through that law and call it legal. So I think these are issues that need to be discussed in far greater detail, because it's not just a matter simply of land, although land is the most important issue, but of very deep-rooted prejudices and of, I think, certain cultures that have developed, especially in the post-1980s period.
I would just say that I don't think it's possible to put the genie back in the bottle, to put the toothpaste back in the tube, you know. There are interventions that have been made in cities to make these sort of world-class cities. And I think the most important way forward is to recognize that there is not this, you know, everything is formal to a degree and informal to a degree, including what we call informality. And we have to recognize that. Formality is not 100% formal. Informality is not 100% informal. Everything exists on the spectrum, and we're all playing in that world. And it's more to the point of recognizing that everyone has the right to their particular blend of it, and particularly the folks who use the city more than the folks who buy the city. And if we can start with that as a sort of baseline, then perhaps we have a place to go.
Great. What an important session this was. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much.